The FBI says most domestic terror arrests this year involved white supremacy, and the Bureau is also now warning about copycat attacks. Quote, the FBI remains concerned U.S.-based domestic violent extremists could become inspired by these to engage in similar acts of violence. From a new statement, FBI Director Wray has also reportedly ordered the agency's field offices to conduct new threat assessments that could thwart any future attempts at mass shootings. FBI officials say they're investigating 850 domestic terror cases, 40% allegedly motivated by race or religion. There are many questions and debates over how do you do this? How do you monitor it? Authorities had just about 19 minutes to track down the terrorist after his anti-immigrant writings appeared online. That's not a lot of time. Should domestic terrorism be treated more similarly to the threat assessments and rapid responses of, say, ISIS? Director Wray testified recently that domestic terror arrests are up. They are similar to international terror, and the majority are motivated, as we've been covering tonight, by, he says, white supremacy.
Just in the first 3 quarters of this year, we've had more domestic terrorism arrests than the prior year, and it's about the same number of arrests as we have on the international terrorism side.
I'm joined now by Mary McCord, the former acting Assistant Attorney General of the Justice Department's National Security Division, who has been advocating specifically to make the domestic terrorism treated more like it is on the international footing, and Rick Stengel, a former diplomat in the Obama administration. Mary, walk us through what it means when the director says that, and he's using the sort of the careful law enforcement bureaucratic language, but he's using that hearing, which was before all this, to say, hey, this is mathematically as bad as the foreign stuff that's treated as so ominous to many Americans.
I think it's really important that Director Wray did give that testimony, and it's a first step in really educating the public that terrorism, the threat of terrorism in the United States is right now greater from white supremacist and far-right violence than it is from Islamist extremist violence. Many people, I think, have thought historically, and certainly since 9/11, they equate terrorism with Islamist extremists. And, you know, as the statistics that Director Wray just mentioned in his testimony really reveal, that's not, you know, a terrorist can be someone who commits a crime of violence for purposes of intimidation and coercion, and to influence government policy through intimidation or coercion, regardless of their ideology, whether it's Islamist extremism, far-right extremism, far-left extremism. But of course, right now, the threat is from the far right.
And so when you lay that out, that's a prism of how to think about it, which is useful for any citizen who wants to be informed, and especially important for law enforcement. What do you think would need to specifically change at more of a policy level?
So I think it is important, you know, not only just to say those words, and it's good that Director Wray said those. It's good that U.S. Attorney John Bash today in El Paso said that the attack there was an act of domestic terrorism. But we don't currently have a federal criminal statute that would apply, that would called terrorism, that would apply to the crimes in El Paso. That's why U.S. Attorney Bash quickly said we're investigating these as hate crimes. These are different things. Hate crimes are important, and they're like a Venn diagram with domestic terrorism, but not all hate crimes are domestic terrorism, and vice versa. And so right now there are a lot of terrorism offenses on the books. Those apply predominantly to terrorist attacks committed on behalf of or in furtherance of the goals of foreign terrorist organizations like ISIS, like Al-Qaeda. But if it is a crime committed in the United States and it's based on an ideology that's not associated with a foreign terrorist organization and it involves a firearm, which is what most of the attacks involve, or even a vehicle, which we've also seen in Charlottesville and elsewhere, there is no terrorism crime that applies to that.
Because of the missing foreign nexus that the law currently makes part of the trigger, basically.
There are a variety of crimes, and there are some, and many of which are focused on this foreign nexus. Now, I do want to be clear. There are some that would apply to white supremacist violence, but it means you need to be using a weapon of mass destruction,
right,
like
you get into the WMD, the Boston
That's
thing,
right.
yeah, which again is a sort of this, what is the statutory trigger and how outdated is it compared to what FBI Director Wray, who was, what we're seeing, and he was, by the way, appointed by Trump, what he's saying. Let me bring Rick Stengel in. Rick, I'm curious your views on everything, so open season, but I wanted to specifically also get your reaction to something we touched on earlier in the hour, which is your old boss, President Obama, not only doesn't comment much, I think he takes a certain kind of civic pride in holding back. We know he has strong views. He could weigh in on anything. He really holds back most of the time. He spoke out after Charlottesville. He spoke out today. The significance of that, as well as anything else you want to touch on.
Thanks, Ari. In fact, I'm going to wholeheartedly endorse what Mary was talking about. There should be a domestic federal terrorism law. In fact, I would argue there should be a domestic terrorism czar. One of the subtext of what Mary's advocating, and a lot of other people are as well, is that we need a whole of government effort against domestic terrorism, just like we've had against international terrorism. The anti-ISIS group at the State Department was under me. There were tremendous resources from all across government, not just money, but intelligence and other kinds of support against that effort. We need that same whole of government effort against domestic terrorism. It's just very clear to me. There have been many more domestic terrorist deaths since 9/11 than international terrorist deaths here in the U.S. As far as what President Obama said today, I mean, look, I'd love him to speak out even more, and I think he was moved primarily by the rhetoric that we hear coming from the Oval Office. I mean, here, you know, President Obama was absolutely a kind of almost infallible in terms of the way he conducted himself, his own rhetoric, his own positive rhetoric about American exceptionalism and all of that. And he's looking at his successor, who is actually, by his rhetoric, kind of promoting a kind of what stochastic terrorism, in the sense that he is basically endorsing so many of these ideas that the white militias and these white terrorists have. And in fact, I would just, before I, last thing I want to say is when I was editor of Time in 2010, we did a cover story about the rise of white militias. And the FBI and DHS all said that part of the reason they were growing during that time was because they were anti-Obama, because they were white supremacists and there was a black president. So what we have now is Barack Obama is gone, and President Trump, his successor, is fueling those movements that grew under the 8 years under President Obama.
And let me read, Rick, for you a little bit, as you mentioned, former President Obama saying the El Paso shooting appears to follow this dangerous trend, embracing racist ideologies. People see themselves obligated to act violently to preserve white supremacy, and he calls on better strategies both in government and tech, Richard.
You know, I mean, never in our history, have white terrorists have someone in the Oval Office who says, you have a friend here in the Oval Office. I mean, that's basically how they interpret it. I mean, they interpret what he is doing as a kind of dog whistle of support for what they're doing. And even today, I mean, it's like, when he reads something from the teleprompter, it just doesn't seem to represent his personal views. And I think, in all the clips that you've shown, and when you looked at this, I won't even call it a manifesto. I think it's a mistake to call them manifesto. They're screeds, they're rantings of madmen, but they echo all of Donald Trump's rhetoric.
Richard Stengel and Mary McCord really digging into not only how to analyze this, but where some of the changes might need to be made in policy. Appreciate both of you on this tough night. Thank you. Hey, I'm Ari Melber from MSNBC. You can see more of our videos right here, or better yet, subscribe to our YouTube channel below. You could have been anywhere in the world, but you're here with us, and we appreciate that.